feedback. Questions. Tonight's session is based on a sort of a combination of a lecture with the slides and then a Q&A, followed by a Q&A. So that's the format. This is a, as I say, combined class with students from MDIA5009, Philosophies of Journalism, and 5011, which is Professional Media Practices. We're joined, fortunately tonight, by our in-house editor, former Fairfax staffer of decades and foreign correspondent, and I think at one point towards before you started to transition into universities, the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald's how did I put it? The iPad version, Connie, is that the right way to say it?
Yeah, the news app, we used to call it. Yeah.
The news app, yeah. So Connie's graciously agreed to join us, and it's going to be great to have you in, Connie, to ask the odd question, I hope. So that's basically the format. Our guest of honour is a journalist who shot to fame in Australia, I think it's fair to say, when he was made the general manager and editor of the Australian edition of BuzzFeed. Now that company you'll all be familiar with, I'm sure. How could you not be? It originated in New York, an internet company, in about 2006, and it really pioneered some of these genres that we've spoken about in our courses over the years. Things like the listicle, which interestingly we don't actually set as assignment work quite often, and maybe we're a bit backward in that regard. I think there are various technical reasons why we feel they're too easy or something like that. They're probably not, but we haven't really got, in my courses anyway, we haven't gotten around to teaching listicles. Maybe we think people can figure those out and are very literate in them themselves. But BuzzFeed also was a pioneer in sort of shareable, news feeds and GIFs and so on. It currently now has, I think, 10 or 11 editions around the world. It's social media. One statistic I came across, 75% of its traffic is traffic by social media, and you've no doubt seen some of its more viral features, such as the food hits on Facebook. Its videos get 5 billion views per month. That's billion with a B, I'm told, or at least that's what their promotions say. Simon will be able to word us up on whether that's the case or not. I first met Simon at a small event, exclusive little event we had at the University of New South Wales. I don't know if you even remember this, Simon, which was called the something like the UNSW Media Ethics Forum, there were a really great range of people there, from American professors of journalism ethics through to Gavin Morris from the ABC, The Conversation, Twitter, and Simon came along representing BuzzFeed, and I wasn't very familiar with BuzzFeed at that time, but I'd heard that it was one of these new sort of digital online organizations, and that it was sort of edgy. That's all I knew about it at that time. But what was amazing about Simon when he came into that room was that he has obviously a very sophisticated understanding of the dynamics of digital media, but also he's somebody who, before he got into digital media, cut his teeth in journalism in Fleet Street on London, and spent 10 years there before he moved on out to Australia. So look, Simon, it's a great privilege to have you in the room. Thank you so much for joining us. I should probably shut up at this stage. If there's any problems you have, just yell out. Otherwise, we're going to be wrapped in attention. We're listening to what you've got to say, and then afterwards, hopefully, if you have the time, to take a few questions. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Christopher. And thank you everyone for having me here this evening. I, like Christopher says, have had an interesting history, career in journalism, doing a number of different things, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal past, which also kind of maps the way the industry has been in this huge kind of transition over the last couple of decades. That's the lifespan of my career. And I'll talk about a couple of the things I've done in that period. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that I see relating to the kind of landscape that those of us who are concerned about journalism, will be aware of, some of the kind of challenges to journalism, which are pretty fundamental. And then I'm going to talk about a little bit about my current attempt at a solution to some of those challenges, which is the startup that I've been working on for about a year now, trying to kind of get finance. So I can talk a little bit about that as well. And I will share some slides. I stopped sharing them then when Chris was talking, so hopefully I can manage to do it again and that it can work. So can you guys see something there which has got my name on it?
Thumbs up.
Can you see that?
Definitely. Yep.
Chris, can you see that?
Yeah, I can see that.
Yes, thumbs up. Good. Okay, so this is me. I am a reporter to start with, and then I became an editor, and then I became a kind of manager. As Chris said, I was the manager of the whole business for BuzzFeed eventually, the last couple of years that I was there. Then I've been a media consultant, I guess, for like the last couple of years, and doing a variety of different work, which I'll talk a little bit about. And in particular, I would sort of describe myself now as a kind of entrepreneur. So, I'll talk a little bit about, like I say, my kind of own kind of personal history in journalism. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my heroes and heroines, because I think that one of the great things about journalism is there's this illustrious kind of canon of, amazing, people that have inspired me, and I think that there's a whole load of people to really look up to. I'll talk about why I think journalism matters, and like I say, some of those challenges that are facing the industry, and then talk a little bit about how I'm trying to fix them. If you want, you can drop questions into the chat. If you want to ask questions, if you want, you can interrupt. I'm happy at any stage. I think we've got an hour or so, so I will talk for maybe 45 minutes, and then I can take questions after that for as long as you want, or I can take questions in between. It's up to you how you want to go. And Chris, I can still see you at the bottom of my screen, but I can't really see the chat because I've got my presentation up. So if you want to, if you want to interject or anything, I can see a thumbs up. But if you want to interject or just let me know. So Christopher's brief was broad and explained, the really interesting range of stuff that you guys are covering on these courses. I think, I will talk about the things that interest me about this industry, and I hope that provides some illumination to you guys about, how that industry has changed. And, it's changed a lot since I began my love affair with news, I guess, delivering newspapers on the streets of Edinburgh in Scotland, where I grew up, mostly in the dark, in the cold, in the winter. And as I sort of dragged this huge bag around in those days, the newspapers were, big, heavy, chunky things, particularly at the weekends. And I used to read that newspaper. Often I'd take one with me to school and circulate it around school. And so kind of my love affair with news began then, very much with a print product. And this was in the 1980s. This was before really anybody was on the internet much. Certainly before the emergence of the web, certainly before the emergence of social. So I've had this kind of, I remember what the world was like, before the internet had radically changed it for everything, but particularly for news. I love that Christopher sent me a quote from Truman Capote, because he's one of my heroes. He's an amazing novelist, but also an amazing journalist. And he wrote a masterpiece of narrative kind of nonfiction, which became described as the new journalism when it was published in the 1960s, called In Cold Blood, which is a gripping novelization of a brutal murder. I'm not giving too much away because it says In Cold Blood in the title of the book, but it's a masterpiece that was first published in the New Yorker. And the New Yorker, then in the 1950s and 60s, and certainly now, is still a great place for for you to read journalism. I subscribe to it. I get it in print. I usually, fall asleep in the bath reading one of their long pieces of reporting. But it's a great place to read, really fabulous journalism. So I would, I'm going to make some recommendations. Like I said, I'm going to talk about some of my heroes, and Truman Capote is certainly one of those. As Chris said, I began my career working in Fleet Street. I was very lucky enough. I studied politics and modern history for a year. Kind of fell out with my tutors, arguing about politics and modern history. Then I did history of art. So I didn't do a journalism degree. I did a postgraduate course at a place which was then called the London College of Printing, which is now part of the London, one of the London universities. Then I got some work experience at a number of places: Time Out magazine, the Telegraph, and the Sunday Times. And I was very lucky enough to get a job straight out of that course at Sunday Times. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the things I did there. But the first kind of major piece of reporting I did was covering in 1999, which is when I had my first job, was the first kind of dot-com boom, which was the rise and growth of many businesses very, very fast, and the markets got a bit ahead of themselves, about 10 years ahead of themselves, in this kind of irrational feeling that everything was going to go to the internet. The world we live in now, they were imagining it 20 years ago. And then I then actually came to Australia as a backpacker and worked a little bit at SMH, and then went back to the UK and worked for another 5 years at the Times. Covering entertainment at that stage, and then moved to Australia. Worked initially and most excitingly for a couple of years up in far north Queensland, rather than coming and moving to Sydney or Melbourne or Canberra. And had a great experience there because I felt I'd missed out a little bit on the traditional route for journalism, for journalists historically, was that you would work on a regional newspaper, usually, a small local paper. You kind of do all the cats up trees and chasing ambulances type reporting, develop your craft and skills, and then move to the big city. And I was very lucky that I got a job at one of the most the biggest newspapers in the UK immediately. So I really felt I'd missed out on that experience. So moving to Australia, I wanted to to take an opportunity that would allow me to see a different part of the country, and far north Queensland was certainly that, and I had a great couple of years up there. Then moved down and moved to Sydney and worked for news at Holt Street for a couple of years, and then got this job at BuzzFeed. And so I've really been focused throughout my career, I guess, on thinking about my career has kind of been about this kind of transition from the printed world, which is what I grew up in. I first got an email address in my second year of uni. So I didn't have email initially when I started uni, when I was first becoming a fresh or whatever. And so the internet in those days, mobile phones, as I'm sure you guys know, was very basic. There wasn't browsers to browse websites, or there weren't apps. There was just a thing called Wireless Accessible Protocol, WAP. And you basically scrolled through it to get to a piece of news, and it was very, very clunky indeed. But it was very exciting in those times to have mobile phones and to have the internet existing and to be able to go surfing around it. And at the time it felt very cutting edge and futuristic. And so I worked and on this section of the Sunday Times as a reporter, the business section. That then we then launched this big 48-page section, which I was the deputy editor of. And really covered the rise of businesses who rise and fell, but had huge IPOs and then crashed and burned spectacularly as a technology reporter. I worked on the launch of the times.co.uk, the first iteration of the Times website in '99, and this was a news brand, the Times, which was had first been called the Times in 1788. So at the same time as people were landing in Sydney Cove, the Times of London was getting going. So it had this long history, and it was very exciting to work on the first kind of website there. And like I said, after my time in Australia, I went back to the Times and worked and covered. I was an arts editor, and I covered all sorts of very exciting things. It was a great job. The business of arts and entertainment, but also things like the Glastonbury Music Festival, which was an amazing event, and the London, Venice and Cannes film festivals, which I went to for 5 years. So very exciting. Got to interview a lot of A-list stars, and have a lot of exciting times in my 20s there. Then I moved to Australia. And like I said, I'd been here before. I guess about 7 or 8 years before I moved to Australia in 2010. I'd been here in 2003, and worked for a year and worked 6 months at the Sydney Morning Herald, and worked on the Herald's website particularly, but also writing and doing some stuff for the Sun Herald. And I really felt afterwards that I wish I kind of stayed. I really loved being in Australia. So then when I met the wonderful woman who's now my wife, who's an Australian in London, and eventually she said that she was tired of the grey skies. Would you be interested in moving to Australia? I kind of jumped at the opportunity. And she actually is from Sydney, but had lived in Melbourne, and neither of us really wanted to live in the city. So my wife was doing a lot of manufacturing in China. She makes leather accessories, and so I kind of sold in Cairns to her as somewhere where you could get to Guangzhou or Hong Kong, in only 6 hours versus 9. And so we went and lived up there, and I had this job. I was the online editor of the Cairns Post, and covered an area. Far North Queensland, as you guys know, is massive, much bigger than the UK. And we've got to do all sorts of exciting things like jump in helicopters looking for Ningaloo, the white whale, or deliver the paper to Normanton on the Gulf of Carpentaria, fly up to Thursday Island in the Torres Straits. In the first year that we were there, we had this huge wet season in 2010-11 in Australia. And so there's huge floods, a cyclone on Christmas Day, then Cyclone Yasi, a Category 5 cyclone, which was just this amazing experience as a reporter. We did a live feed for basically 36 hours, live video on the top of news.com.au, telling the story to the world, doing interviews with the BBC News and the CNN, and it was just really amazing. And I just had a great experience up there. I really, I loved it. It was kind of crazy being in the tropics, but going swimming in beaches where there's crocodiles and irukandjis, and it was a hell of a lot of fun. And it gave me a great understanding of this crazy diversity geographically we've got, and in Australia as well, and actually culturally up there as well, where, as I'm sure you know, it's a very strong Indigenous culture up in Far North Queensland, and from the Torres Strait, of course, as well. Then I moved down to Holt Street and worked, for a network team that basically created content primarily for news.com.au, but also, stuff that was aiming to be in page 3 in the center spread of the weekend papers. And it was kind of, it was fun. It was a well-resourced team of about 100 people working on this. But culturally, I struggled a little bit with it, and I was like, really looking for something, really looking for something different. And I spent a lot of time in the dunny, in the toilet, reading this new website called BuzzFeed, scrolling through the list. And one time I almost fell off the toilet seat when I saw that they were advertising for an Australian editor, and I was like, oh my God. And I've been excited about BuzzFeed, not only because of the dumb lists and the entertaining content, but also because around the time of the Boston Marathon, they've done some pretty amazing reporting, kind of debunking a lot of the kind of swirling kind of conspiracy theories and kind of disinformation, as it wasn't called then, but as it would be called now, around who was responsible for that. And I realized at that stage that BuzzFeed actually had a team of reporters. And then as I learned more about them, I realized, that they were doing a lot of interesting work in 2012 around the US election. And they had a team of reporters kind of on the bus with Obama and with Mitt Romney. And I was really curious about their kind of approach to news, about making it accessible to young people. Really like what they were doing. So yeah, I was lucky enough to get this job as the founding editor of BuzzFeed Australia. And in the beginning, it was really exciting. I was able to be a reporter for the first time in, I'd been managing teams and being an editor for, most of the preceding 10 years. So I was actually reported quite a lot that first year. We initially did lists and quizzes and all those kind of classic BuzzFeed things for the first year. But even in that time when we didn't have any news reporters, we started doing stuff on, I remember this moment, Tony Abbott gave a speech to, a logging conference in Tasmania. And he talked about kind of Australia being this empty place where no one had lived prior to the arrival of civilization in 1788. And we did a story which was a BuzzFeed list, but which was a list of the sort of not 65,000 things, but a whole load of things about the indigenous culture that had existed here for centuries, millennia before white colonization. And it went really viral. The thumbnail had that classic kind of map of the sort of 700 different indigenous clans and groups, and that sense of this being a rainbow nation. It went really viral, and on the back of that, I managed to persuade my bosses in New York that there was a real appetite for news with BuzzFeed style here in Australia. And so then we were able to hire, some really incredible reporters doing really important beats, and Indigenous affairs reporters we hired. We had a brilliant reporter called Lane Sainty, who was a very young reporter. I hired her straight out of University of Sydney, and she covered LGBT, which was a new beat, which no other outlet had reporters covering this really important issue. And it was great timing, because it was the time where the same-sex marriage debate was really intensifying, and it allowed us. I mean, I've got a brilliant photo that I have of Lane and Josh, one of our other reporters, on the front row of the press gallery the day that the legislation passed, sitting with Patricia Carvallis and Fran Kelly and all these kind of illustrious names. And it was really, what was great about the experience was that we realized that with, BuzzFeed was brilliant at growing big audiences, like Christopher said, huge audiences. In Australian terms, we ended up reaching 10.9 million Australians a month, making us really the biggest kind of cross-platform digital publisher. We were very focused on the power and the growth of the audience on Facebook, on YouTube, on other social platforms, about really being distributed. And despite having a small team, this is a selection of our team on a kind of a team building exercise that we had up in Seal Rocks. We were really able to kind of punch well above our weight. I think we had a bureau in Parliament House. Actually, we didn't have reporters there the whole time. The reporters lived in Sydney, went down there on sitting weeks, but we had live shows on Twitter when we were there. And we really, I think, had a presence. We did, we created international news. Excitingly, we did an interview, the first emoji interview with Julie Bishop, and we interviewed her via, we actually sat in the office and took photos, but we sent her questions, and she replied by emojis, and she ended up causing a slight diplomatic incident because she described Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, as the red angry emoji face. Which then got reported out and actually ended up being discussed in Senate estimates. So it's there in Hansard that this piece of reporting kind of created all these news stories in the New York Times, etc. Blah blah blah. So it was a lot of fun. And like I said, the last couple of years, I also had responsibility for the commercial side of the business as well as the editorial. So I learned a lot about startups and about team culture and about the ability to have impact in an information environment which is becoming even more challenging. So it was a really great experience, and I'm very, very grateful that I had that opportunity. It was, a hell of a lot of fun. Since then, and actually, just so you guys are really clear, that in 2019, BuzzFeed made some pretty big changes internationally. So Christopher was right that we had at that point 10 international bureaus or editions. Japan, India, Mexico, Brazil, France, etc. At that point, BuzzFeed decided that they were really going to focus in much more on the United States, because mainly, but I think because they're keen to have for their backers, and they're very big venture-backed business like Vice and Vox and other digital publishers of the last decade. And a better way for them, they felt, to get to where they wanted to go was to make some reductions. So they made reductions major reductions around the world, more than 250 jobs, and I was offered a redundancy, which I took at that stage. And the reason I did take that was because I was very proud of everything we'd done with the business here, but I was particularly proud of the journalism that we'd done. And the thing that was really on the chopping block here in Australia was our 15-strong news team, which was basically cut down to almost nothing. And for me, it was like, I felt that was a good moment for me to leave. I felt very proud of everything we'd achieved up until that point. And it just gave me a nice moment, actually, at the same time as my wife had our second child, to kind of take a bit of a pause after 20 years as a journo. And so, as I said, over the last couple of years, really, I've been doing lots of consultancy work with a range of different publishers. The biggest piece of that was a big project I've done. Really, like I said, I had the opportunity to actually have a more you know, after running a business for 5 years, to kind of stop and pause and look at the landscape as it is. And for me, it felt that the biggest kind of issue was, you know, the lack of innovation on the local level, where, you know, and I'll talk about some of the trends that are impacting on journalism broadly, but at the local level, there's not innovation in Australia, and there is more internationally. And I felt that it was, I wanted to try something in the local space, you know, at the local level. I feel like there certainly has much more media diversity at the national level than it did when I was first here as a backpacker, when there was really just, you know, Fairfax and News Corp and the ABC. Now we've got Junkie, we've got Pedestrian, we've had BuzzFeed and HuffPo, we've got the New York Times and now the Washington Post here. We've had, you know, got Crikey in the conversation. So there's a lot of choice if you're interested in national news in Australia. But on the local level, there's been there's some major kind of structural problems. So I have been doing some work around that. And last year, the biggest piece of that was a 9-month project I did, which was funded by Google News Initiative, which worked with 5 regional publishers at different stages. You know, a magazine publisher in Tasmania transitioning their quarterly magazine to a digital product. The Sunraysia Daily, which is a big paper in Mildura, a group of papers covering the Riverina. You know, York Peninsula Country Times, a paper in the Scenic Rim in Queensland, a paper in Wagga in New South Wales. And it was really interesting to work with these publishers and see most of them had only just begun or not even begun a transition to digital, and yet their business model is under immense pressure because of the fact that most of their advertising is really moving fast to the internet. You know, and so that's really interesting. So that informed quite a bit of what I'm working on now, which I'll talk about a bit later on. And then I'm also on some boards. So I'm on UTS's board of Centre for Media Transition. I'm on a group that the Judith Neilson Institute are developing a kind of hyperlocal association, and I'm involved in the advisory group for that. And I'm also involved with an organisation called the Walkley Foundation, which are awards, journalism awards, you know, the most prestigious journalism awards. I was on the judging board for a couple of years when I was at BuzzFeed, and since then I've been really involved in their awards as an observer myself and another experienced journo. And I'll do some mentorship for them. And one of the journalists I've been mentoring is a chap called Perry, who's in Murray Bridge in South Australia. And excitingly, he just won Substack, which some of you may have heard of, is a new, fairly new platform for journalists to distribute their content and to take subscription revenue. And Perry applied for a local grant from Substack and was, you know, lucky enough to be one of the 12 winners, and so is now $100,000 from Substack to help him develop his business over the next 12 months. So that's good. So that's kind of been what I've been up to, and I will come back and talk about PS Media, which is my startup that I've been working at. But before that, I thought I'd go back through the mists of time, inspired by Truman Capote, and talk about some of these heroes and heroines of mine. And I guess, you know, it's part of, you know, one of the things that really inspired me about journalism is that you know, it's an opportunity. It's a very exciting job, I think, journalism, because, you know, I'm a nosy bastard. It gives me an opportunity, when it did as a reporter, to ask people, to get answers to the questions that I was curious about. And so you know, you have to be be tenacious and have kind of a bit of like rat-like cunning to catch people on the phone or to track them down. But it gives you an opportunity to understand the world. And for somebody like me, who as a kid always had so many questions, it gave me an opportunity to find answers. And then, you know, as I became older, I realized that one of the great things about journalism is that, you know, you can shine a light on the world, right? And you can you can uncover stuff that other people do not want uncovered. And so it feels like, you know, maybe this wasn't the driver when I was 18, but it's kind of a, you know, it's a very important part of how society operates. And now that it's really under pressure in a way it's not been for centuries, in kind of free and democratic society, certainly, it feels that, you know, as it declines, that there's a greater awareness in places about what is being lost. And so these are some of the role models, and you'll see that there's a mix of people from different stages. I've actually got, you know, shelves of books, I realize, about written by journalists or about the practice of journalism. I'm passionate about it. I can't really imagine what else I would do. I really love it. And, you know, one of the great tragedies, I think, of where we're at is that, you know, the pathway which existed for me to become a journalist has become much harder. It's just there's fewer journalism jobs, and I really hope that there's going to be innovation like what I'm trying to do that will allow more people to have a job in this most exciting of professions. So I'm going to go way back first of all to an amazing woman called Nellie Bly, who was basically a contemporary, maybe a lesser known contemporary of Jules Verne and the 80 Days Around the World. And she traveled around the world and wrote a brilliant book. She was a real trailblazer in a time when women still didn't have the freedom that women now have in Western society, certainly, to travel and move independently. And she did a whole range of brilliant stuff. She was a real amazing trailblazer. But I think the thing that stands out, which I've got a copy of, is a book called 10 Days in a Madhouse, where it was really 70 years before Truman Capote, she did new journalism by going to live in an asylum. And she went to stay there. She got herself admitted. She wanted to see what it was like in a mental hospital. And she did this brilliant piece of reporting, which ultimately, and this is like what journalism is about to me, led to significant change in society. She brought awareness to something that society didn't know about. And then because she reported it, there was changes to the way that asylums were administered in America after that. So she's a really amazing woman who, she's a whole range of other things. This particular was the thing that made her kind of famous. Everyone probably has heard of Ernest Hemingway. I think he's a great novelist, but he was also a reporter, and he has a style which is I think one of the things is you write as a reporter that you realize over time is that less is more, and that you don't need to use big flowery adjectives, or you don't need to. What you need to do is make your reporting concise and clear and really specific, and the better you can do that, the better your work is, the more digestible it is, the more economical it is at delivering the key information. And so Hemingway is a genius at this, and he has a whole range of fiction which is basically very much almost non-fiction, because he had this amazing life where he his lived. Sorry, I hope you can't hear my dogs too loudly. But For Whom the Bell Tolls is a brilliant novel, but it's really based on his experiences as a journalist covering the Spanish Civil War for the North American News Association. So he's an inspirational figure. As is George Orwell, who I'm sure you know, wrote Animal Farm in 1984, true classics. 1984 is a really brilliant way of understanding some of what's going on now with misinformation and disinformation. But he was fundamentally first and foremost a journalist, and again, did amazing journalism where Down and Out in Paris and London he did another one in the north of England, but a piece of long form reporting where he again went and spent long time living and working in the most deprived areas of Paris and London in order to report what poverty was really like there. And I think that this sense of really understanding communities and being empathetic is really profound and really important for journalism. That sense of going there and understanding and learning it yourself. And I love this quote of his, that journalism is printing what someone else does not want published. Everything else is public relations. And at a time now when so much of what ends up in our newspaper, sadly, is literally just a press release, it's really important to, I always say to my reporters when I was leading teams that, it's a badge of honor when somebody is screaming at your editor down the phone, telling them that they need to take this thing down, or that this journalist should be fired, because ultimately that's part of the job, is the scrutiny, is shining the light on things that people don't want to know about, and keeping society kind of working and being healthy, right? Martha Gellhorn was a brilliant reporter, a war reporter, very inspiring, who actually ended up married to Hemingway. And she had a deep sense of the role of journalism being kind of about that bridge between facts and understanding, that ability that a journalist has to help explain complicated issues in a clear way that would really help society, individuals and society understand itself better. So she was a brilliant reporter, and again, you'll see that there's a theme that a lot of these are war reporters. I think they're very inspiring. They often did many other parts of reporting, but she wrote she was there in Normandy. She spent a lot of time as a war reporter in the Second World War and in wars afterwards, and has just again a really humanistic approach to reporting. Harry Evans is a chap who I worked at the Times of London and the Sunday Times. He was the former editor of the Sunday Times and briefly for the Times. He was then went to the States and with his wife Tina Brown, who was the editor of the New Yorker and Vanity Fair, an amazing kind of power couple, British power couple who went to New York. But he is a brilliant newspaper editor, but also has written multiple books about, like Orwell, about the clarity of writing and really essential English and Do I Make Myself Clear are really about how you can pass your writing down to deliver something that's like I said, kind of economical but precise and brilliant. So he is a real hero of mine who sadly died last year. But Google him. His obituaries are wonderful. He had a brilliant life. As did this chap, Hunter S. Thompson. So Harry Evans is very sober and kind of establishment British, a Northern Englishman, but quite traditional. Hunter S. Thompson, you probably or hopefully maybe have heard of, or Fear and Loathing, which was a kind of a mescaline-inspired kind of trip to Los Angeles, so Las Vegas. But he was kind of what is now described as a gonzo journalist, writing mainly for Rolling Stone. He wrote a brilliant book about the Hells Angels, brilliant piece of reportage. He wrote this brilliant book, the best book about campaign reporting I think I've ever read, called Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, which is with Nixon and McGovern, who was challenging him for the American presidency. And he wrote brilliantly colourful, fantastically, illuminating and very contrarian kind of journalism. So, I think what you're kind of maybe seeing is that journalists come in all kind of shapes and sizes and colours, and they're really kind of, he was. He's a madman who eventually wanted his to be fired. I think his ashes were fired out of a cannon after he died, which was a request that he left. Robert Fisk is a reporter who spent most of his life in the Middle East, and it was really about the vital importance of journalism being like the first draft of history and being there and witnessing what's happening, and knew kind of the Middle East better than I think any kind of Western reporter. Lived in Beirut for decades and wrote this great book about the Great War for Civilization, which is very illuminating. He was very critical of he's British, but he's very critical of what Britain had done carving up the map in Israel and Palestine and Iraq, and understanding the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, the Gulf War before that, and where they came from, which was really Britain drawing lines on maps and creating division. It's really interesting, very, very interesting to think about our world now. We obviously saw the Gaza, turn into another kind of shooting war several months ago, and it'll just keep on coming. So Fisk, if you're interested in the Middle East, is a brilliant person to read. Mary Colvin is somebody I worked with briefly at the Sunday Times, who was very intimidating woman who she lost one of her eyes covering the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka in the early 90s, and she was somebody who had just amazing presence, and I remember her just somebody I spent some time working with as a colleague, and unfortunately eventually she died in Syria in the civil war there, in a bombing, and so had this amazing life, and gave everything to kind of journalism. And the last but not least, thankfully there's somebody who's still alive. This is Kate Adie, who as a kid, I guess in 1989 I was 14 years old, I guess I was. And Kate Adie was the one of, if not the only, certainly British reporter who was in Tiananmen Square in 1989, witnessing what happened over a week that intensified into kind of a terrible experience that she vividly reported on. And then she had this amazing career, which she reported a lot in Africa in the early 90s as well. And just a really inspiring woman. Again, a huge amount of empathy, and I think this is a kind of common thread in the reporters that inspire me, is that sense of really, understanding, people's perspectives and understanding, differences. And she went back to China a lot. She loved China, but I think was terribly conflicted about what had happened there. in 1989 in particular. Okay, so that's my kind of wrap through of this. I'm just going to have a quick slug of water. So you'll probably, you'll see. I'd like to talk a little bit now about kind of like the present, about kind of where we're at, because I really feel that journalism really matters. I feel that what we're seeing increasingly is that democracy is under threat. Democracy, I guess, has been under threat at different times, since the beginning of democracy. But in places like America, Britain, where I'm from, Australia to a degree, the collapse in the business model for news is actually creating some major issues for healthy democracy. There's this polarization, this misinformation. I'm going to talk about some of this. And I think really what we've seen through the bushfires and through the pandemic is the absolute essentialness of news. And when we're in an environment now where there's a lot more confusion, I think it's really important that people strive to be journalists and that people try and figure out sustainable business models for news, because news is, I think, never more important than when society is under pressure. And I think some of those war reporters who shone a light on what was happening in the worst of situations have showed how important it is for us to kind of understand and to have insight into and trustworthy information that we can rely on. And unfortunately, what we're seeing internationally is this trend to news deserts, which is very well articulated in the US, but it's increasingly the case in across Europe and here in Australia as well, and what that kind of means. So I feel that what we've seen over the last decade is this kind of collapse in the business model and this increasing threat and pressure on democracy fundamentally. And this kind of sense of kind of like polarization and misinformation, and that this represents this market failure represents a real problem for the health of our communities. And my belief is that news really is essential. That that the pandemic in particular has shown us, like I say, why this news is so important, and why what we're seeing in America is that people who are relying on Fox News for their news are also people who are not vaccinated, are therefore also the people now where Delta is ripping through America, ending up in hospital and dying. Almost nobody who's vaccinated is in hospital, and yet these people are getting their news from somewhere which is sprouting misinformation and disinformation. So trustworthy news is kind of essential. And part of the issue I do think that is leading to this, and this is what we've seen in the States, and I think what we're starting to see sadly in Australia as well, is the growth of these news deserts, where all the places in deep red on this map have no local news at all now. Huge areas where on the county level there's no local news. There's increasing areas around America where there's only kind of one news source in a lot of these places. So what we're seeing with this is, on a local level, the lack of reporters in local government meetings affects how those councils operate, how courts work, how schools and hospitals work. It keeps fundamentally local officialdom kind of honest. And then what we've seen in this amazing report out of the University of North Carolina in the States that's been running 5 years is that without local reporters, corruption increases, and there's all sorts of negative effects, including high school attendance dropouts and crime rates go up and all these things. And I think that beyond this, there's a correlation in America certainly, which you could argue is something that could potentially happen here, where there's been 2,000 newspapers closed over the last 10 years, local newspapers in America. And so people don't have a local news source. Instead, they've increasingly turned to Fox News or to Facebook groups or to crazy YouTube videos. And they haven't got this local sense of what reality is, and they're looking at these sources on the internet often. And that, I think was a contributing factor to the kind of rise of Trump. And I think here, where we're seeing similar pressure, particularly in regional areas on news, and a huge number of closures, particularly last year with the pandemic in Australia, and yet and also WIN and Prime and other regional news outlets now stopping their regional bulletins, and yet Sky News Australia are now going to be free to air in regional Australia. So I think, and Sky News Australia, great in the day covering Canberra, a bit kind of loopy after dark, I think. So yeah, I think this is a big kind of issue, and I think an issue that we're going to see more of in Australia as well. So yeah, the challenges is the business model, the kind of attention economy, this growth in disinformation and misinformation. So the broken business model, and this is something that's really informing my startup, I think, is that when I began as a newspaper reporter, newspapers had 75% of their revenue was in advertising in the paper and classifieds in the paper, and then maybe about 25% coming from cover sales. And that had allowed papers like, the Times and Sunday Times, like the Sydney Morning and Herald and Age here, to become huge, massive, particularly on Saturdays and Sundays, things that would like almost break your table when they landed on them. They were so thick with car ads and real estate ads and all these things. And all that, what's described as rivers of gold, allowed newspapers to really have big reporting teams, to have big investigative teams, to really, have really good journalism going for 20 or 30 years in the latter part of the last century. What has happened since the emergence of the internet, and actually, here it's been really interesting with the digital platforms inquiry, the narrative that's come out of the major players, because actually way before Facebook and Google were here in Australia, News Corp and what was then Fairfax were setting up things like Seek, car sales, REA, Domain, now spun off companies, but basically so much of the dollars went away from the newspapers to these other big players, the Domains, the REAs, the car sales. And that fundamentally has put in Australia and in the US and in the UK and in all sorts of other markets around the world has really become very, very challenging for the economics, the business model that allows newspapers to invest in public interest journalism. So in the UK, over the last 10 years, newspaper sales are down 50%. In the US, as I said, more than 2,000 local newspapers have closed. In Australia, prior to the pandemic, 100 papers had closed, local papers, over the last 10 years. Last year alone, 164 papers closed. And what we've seen, it is a huge reduction in the number of reporters working. So now 47% fewer, and that's basically 6,000 fewer journalists working in Australia than there were in 2010. And that's across metropolitan and local papers. And local papers are certainly much smaller than they were a decade ago. But I do think that what we're seeing, that now people are saying subscription is the kind of savior. If you look at the UK, basically it's the Telegraph, the Times, and the Guardian are taking like 90% of subscription revenue. In the US, it's the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. In Australia, probably it's the AFR, Age, and SMH, and the Australian are taking the vast percentage of revenue. So yes, we're going to have some big voices, some big metropolitan or national voices in media, but what's going to happen for everything else? And I think that I think that's very, very concerning indeed. Part of what's really happened over the last decade, of course, is the rise of the social platforms. So particularly the rise of Facebook, which is gigantic. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, etc. YouTube, which is obviously Google owned, which has been a major attention, huge audiences. And I'm not saying everything's bad about Facebook and YouTube at all. BuzzFeed spent a major part of the last 5 years when I was there building our kind of business on those platforms. But what they have done, and I think this is almost inarguable, is that they've created kind of filter bubbles where you follow people that share your worldview, and the platforms, the algorithms of the platforms drives content that creates this kind of filter bubbles and polarizes people into kind of worldviews which have become increasingly kind of concerning, toxic. On a local level. Often it just means you don't really know anything. You don't have this engagement so much. We all walk around. Every time you walk around, you see everybody walking around reading their phones. People aren't talking to their neighbors. They aren't engaging with people. But I do think that that world where so much of our economy is driven by what's happening on platforms, and where because of that and because there's so much attention there, so much of the advertising dollars are there. And where people who have driving media agendas that are not necessarily based in truth have really flourished, because they're kind of preaching to they're able to reach people far more effectively than they would ever have been able to reach before. I'm thinking like Alex Jones and InfoWars and people like that. That it's creating this really damaging effect on our societies. And I think in the UK, we've saw that with what happened with Brexit, I think Trumpism is definitely a major driver of Trumpism is the demise of the business model supporting news and the kind of the ability of the platforms to drive polarization. And at the same time, because of that, the trust in news, trust in journalism is really cratered, and it's, journalists are not thought of as trustworthy as a profession. Maybe they are by a certain cohort in society, but absolutely not by others. And so this is a major problem, I think, for news, the sense of declining trust. And really the sense of kind of like information disorder, where the reality of your world doesn't match what you sometimes read or listen to or watch. You're sort of told this kind of crazy, scary kind of way of what the world is like, and it's not like that actually in reality. But the misinformation and disinformation, and we've seen it. I think American democracy remains under amazing pressure, and I think that people are kind of through the looking glass a little bit and are happy to believe in what Kelly Conway called alternative facts, an alternative reality. And I think this is a major challenge to journalism now, because journalism needs to rebuild kind of credibility, rebuild trust, build, through the practice of journalism, smart ways of connecting with people, of having people understand perspectives other than their own. I think is really important, because otherwise, I think the kind of invisible role that the fourth estate has played in just keeping, there was always disagreement. People always had disagreement about what should be done about a thing. But generally, certainly when I was a kid and reading newspapers and first working for them, there was an agreement on what reality was, And what's happened now is that there's different realities existing at the same time, and I think that is incredibly dangerous. And so I think journalism has a vital role. I'm not feeling entirely confident about it, but I think journalism has a vital role in trying to keep society cohesive. So I'm nearly done, Chris. I'm just going to talk a little bit about PS Media. I'm really happy to share more about PS Media if people are interested. I've got other decks I can talk about that. But basically, PS Media is driven by my belief and my co-founders' belief that there needs to be a kind of different way, and that what we need to do is be inspired by the great things that network effects have delivered, but try and create a different kind of platform experience, architecture, designed to create community kind of cohesion, but help people kind of and build that with communities. One of the things we're really driven about is that feeling that it's well expressed in Kevin Rudd's petition to the Parliament last year. So Kevin Rudd, authored a petition about concern about the lack of media diversity in Australia. In November last year, it was signed by 500,000 Australians, the biggest petition in the Parliament's history. And now there's an inquiry that's been running since February in the Senate. And so we think there's a concern about the lack of media diversity in Australia. And part of that we think is about ownership. So we want to create this media business that is designed ultimately to have impact, for you as an individual, for your community. And ultimately, in time, we want to deploy the platform to show the impact of our journalism. So it's very kind of purposeful driven. And we're asking people to become co-owners of that. And so they will have a stake. Rather than paying a subscription or a membership, you'll pay to own a share of the business. And then that will allow you within your community to help determine how we distribute our profits. And we're going to distribute our profits back into communities on community initiatives. And so this is the whole idea of this, is that we want to be kind of local, because we believe that that's where the biggest kind of issue is in the lack of media diversity. We want to work with our communities collaboratively, so really helping understand the whole perspectives of the community and the myriad different range of opinions, but to deliver something that is valuable in a way that they're not getting elsewhere. And I think what's been really interesting to me in the process is I began this thinking that the news deserts were all in regional Australia, but actually in like the inner west of Sydney or the inner suburbs of Melbourne and Brisbane and Perth, there's news deserts. There's places where there's no local newspapers. And so you might get some reporting of West Connex in the Sydney Morning Herald occasionally, or a stoush at a particular council, but generally the day-to-day of what's going on is not reported. So around Australia, there's now councils, scores and scores of LGAs where there's no scrutiny at all about what's going on, and so developments are popping up or initiatives are happening. People don't know what's happening, and so we want to provide something which is very different and tries to rebuild some of the kind of fundamentals there. So we started off with this Charter of Community Responsibility, and it's belief that outside of media, we're seeing so many organizations with purpose kind of at their core. And we believe that, and this is a draft, we're going to take this out to our a number of communities and test it out. This is basically a commitment to our communities in terms of like how we want to be more, we want to be more diverse in our ownership in terms of the way we serve communities. And we want to be really clear about what we're doing with people's data, about how we're holding ourselves accountable. So we've got this kind of commitment, this charter to our communities. And so I'm really excited about taking it and bring it to life. This is something we want to build with our communities. Our kind of business model is, we believe there's about 100 communities where PS could live and breathe. And so we want to have this co-ownership piece. We need 1,000 co-owners in a particular place. Then we'll bring a masthead and reporters to them. We want to do this much more engaged type of journalism where each of those 1,000, the news is accessible and free to everyone. We just want the co-owners to help us build this thing. And for them, the value proposition is a bit like, the one that The Guardian has, which now has 150,000 people paying for it in Australia, where you make the news accessible to everyone. So rather than hitting an ACM or a 7 West or a News Corp paywall, you'll be able to pay so that everyone can access news. And we believe that then these co-owners will help us and anyone else who signs up do a much better job of understanding the huge range of perspectives in the community. And then we've got a diversified revenue mix, which we've given a lot of thought to, and we've worked on some really interesting products. And it's obviously not advertising is a very small part of what we're trying to do. We've got some really amazing brand partners on board and interesting ideas to make this sustainable. The whole idea is to aim for sustainability. And at the moment, we're out there, we're trying to raise some seed capital, and then we're going to go take our kind of minimum viable product out, test the platform, run some pilots, and then hoping to raise additional capital later in an early part of next year. So that's me. I am here now to answer any questions. If you want to contact me, those are my details. So you can email me either at my work or personal, find me on LinkedIn or Twitter, or sign up to psmedia.com.au for updates on what PS is.
Wow. Can you,
I'll stop sharing this, will I?
Yes.
How can I do that?
Let's have a look.
Stop sharing?
That's it.
There we go.
Yeah, you've done. Wow. Can you hear me, Simon?
I can't hear you, Chris.
I've got my microphone on. Let's have a look. We're getting some feedback already. Maddie Constantine sort of saying how that was fantastic. Harrison, Leckenberry's got it. Yeah, we're getting some good feedback, but you can't hear me. I wonder why. Let me see. Connie, can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Aha.
And I can hear
Okay.
Simon loud and clear.
Simon, well, we're going to have to. Everybody can hear me, but Simon can't. All right, let me have a look. Simon, can you hear me yet?
I can't hear you, no.
I can hear you.
You can hear me. Okay.
Everything's on. There it is there. Look over there. I think that's it there. But I can't control that. Let's have a look. Hello?
Oh,
Nope.
sorry.
It's odd.
Very weird. Can you hear me, Simon?
No, he can't hear anyone.
No one.
Okay. What shall I do? Let's have a look. Maybe he needs to switch off presenter mode. Okay, so I think I might be able to do that. Let me have a look at what I can do. I go out and I'll change back to participant and save it. And fingers crossed. go back. Simon, can you hear me now? I can't hear him at all.
Did you throw him out of the session?
No,
He's not there
he's
anymore.
Yeah, he's I'm seeing an icon with Simon Crerar #2. He's reconnecting now.
Okay.
He may need to exit and his camera's off. That's yeah. I think he's coming back. Have faith. He's coming back. He's joining back.
I can hear you.
You're back.
Yeah.
Ah, well, fantastic, Simon. That's great. We always get there. It just takes a while. Some of this online learning stuff, it's a little bit clunky, but wow, that was just magisterial. That was you took us from the the docklands to the rainforests to the news deserts, to the heroes of journalism, all of which I completely endorse. I was trying to show you my picture of Ernest Hemingway up on the wall behind me up there, but I'm not sure if you can see that. Just I was reading. I always like to read the first few lines of A Movable Feast. I don't know if that's one of your favorite books, but A Movable Feast. The language, the way he starts into a sentence, like halfway through what's happening. He has this amazing capacity to, where he enters a story, it's always like he makes a reference backwards so that you feel like you've sort of been with him already for a long time. Love that. But look, I could go on and on and on. And the work that you're doing, it seems so innovative and so significant. And we could just really, it's so heartening to hear, well articulated, practical, focused, attempts at solutions to the sorts of things that we all know are happening. We've got so much information about what's wrong, but and there is work going on to try to do that. So when you to fix it, but it's obviously not in front of us all the time. But that's just fantastic. So thank you, Simon. That was brilliant. And there was quite a lot of news, I think, in what you were saying as well. I think your talk actually had some real news headlines in it for those of our students who are doing a task this evening. But also, I think the questions are going to provoke you, and hopefully, as your comments. I've explained to students how this is proactive journalism. So news conferences are about, we have a figure who's here to talk to us. They have authority. You, because of your what you're doing, because of your history, what you say is news. So Connie's here as the editor of Newsworthy. She's hoping that our students can tomorrow produce a story of some kind based on what you had to say. And all the students from 5011, I'm sure you were all listening. I'm sure you're all taking notes. I've advised people to try to maybe record it themselves and time code their recordings as we went through, which is an old practice of mine, so that it's easy to quickly find that quote that the source has delivered. So now I guess the next thing we have to do is go to questions, and I'll just go across to the chat and see if they've all been abolished. Let's have a look. Yes, it looks like they've all gone. Who knows? Hang on a sec. I've got plenty of them in backup on a different platform. Yeah, okay, good. All right, so what I might, I really like to get some students' voices online here. So I'm going to call out students who and the task here will be, I think what I'll do is I'll ask students that I know are in 5011, because you are the guys who are having to do the writing tonight. And I think I'll start with Zoe. Zoe's originally from France. She's in the postgrad stream here at UNSW. Zoe, can you turn on your mic and ask a couple of questions to Simon?
Yeah, I just have to find my question again. Sorry. Like,
I can read it out if you want.
I found my question. So so my first one.
Simon, you can hear us? Are you?
I can hear you.
The same.
Okay, fantastic. All right, let's go.
Yeah. So my first question is, what do you think about the internet regarding journalism? Do you think it could help journalism or deteriorate it considerably in the long term? Sorry, it's middle of the day.
You were dropping in and out a little bit, Zoe. Could you just, well, I might be able to back that up.
Yeah.
No, that's okay.
I have a problem with my internet.
That's okay. I'll see if I can find your, I'm sure I can find it here somewhere, you told. Hang on a sec. Try again. I think the line might have improved, Zoe.
Yeah, I'm going to try again. So my first question, actually I can't pronounce it properly, so I'm going to change. So about your new project of local news startup. Would you ask for help from governments to implement more local media?
Good question.
Thank you.
Good question, yeah. So we have met with some senior members of the Department of Communications, because what doesn't exist at the moment is support specifically for journalism startups. So startups generally can take advantage of things like research and development tax incentives and various government measures, but specifically for news startups or journalism startups, there isn't government support. And there was a program that the Department of Communications ran after a Senate inquiry about 4 years ago, called the Small Publisher and Innovation Fund, and that was designed actually to help smaller publishers, basically evolve their business models. But actually, that was only for established businesses with turnover and who'd been running. So actually, one of the things that's an issue we think here in Australia is the lack of government support. And interestingly, in other markets in Europe and in North America, there's much more government support for startups generally, and also actually more philanthropic support. This is another major issue in Australia, is the tax environment doesn't allow for not-for-profit journalism really to exist. So some of the things that are really providing good support internationally, government and philanthropy, we're not really seeing it for startups here.
Okay. Zoe, you had a follow-up question too, I think, which was, and I'll just read it out. Are you not afraid that if you get government money, that that might involve, that might in some way oblige you to government and make you, in a sense, compromised?
Yeah, I think that's traditionally journalism media organizations have been historically very reluctant to take government money because of the sense of that creating some kind of issues with their reporting or whatever. But actually, as I'm sure you guys are aware, the government is one of the bigger advertisers in Australia. So media companies do take government money for advertising. I think that the money that came through the Department of Communications and ACMA was delivered as grants. So you definitely had to submit, but there was no kind of, nothing there that said you couldn't report aggressively on your government, whether it's your state, local or federal government. And I think that as an industry that, the journalism industry has been under pressure from government legislation for a number of years around the practice of reporting. So always when you are considering government money, I think one of the things that's interesting around what's happened with the the bargaining code and the pressure that's been exerted very successfully on Facebook and Google to pay publishers is that despite the legislation and the feeling that that then would go and the government would play an integral role, all the deals have been done with the legislation. Whereas what we're seeing, I mean, France, Zoe, is an interesting example. France, just over the last 24 hours, have basically asking Google to pay them 500 million euros and to distribute among publishers. And as I understand it, in France, that will be distributed much more directly by the government. I actually think that that should have happened in Australia too. I think this would have been a better exercise if the money had gone to like a Journalism Australia type entity, like a Screen Australia entity, and everybody in society would be able to see how this money is distributed. At the moment, what we have is all these deals done in smoky boardrooms, and tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars going mainly to the three major businesses. But no, we don't actually know if that money is going to journalism. So yeah, it's very interesting, and I think it raises a lot of questions taking money from government in terms of does this impact on how you can report them? I guess what you would say is that in the UK, with the BBC, and certainly here with ABC, almost the biggest kind of thorn in the government side is the ABC's Four Corners program. And the fact that the money for the ABC comes directly from the government doesn't stop the government, the ABC and SBS and publicly funded broadcasters are often some of the biggest critics of the government of the day. So yeah, it's an interesting question.
I'll make a follow-up, Simon. So that process that we went through in Australia with the government taking on the big tech companies, any lingering thoughts about that process? You've said you think that it was a better outcome in France. Do you see any likelihood of that being revisited? Because my impression has been that the big players or the big media players were sort of satisfied with what they got, or have I got that wrong?
Well, I mean, I think it's very interesting that, as you know, it's been a long process because it came out of a report that the Australian ACCC Competition Commission investigated the longer term impact of Facebook and Google in particular on the news media business. And when we were at BuzzFeed, we had to give multiple submissions and share a huge amount of detail about our business, about our commercial business, about our headcount, about the amount of journalism we produced and where it was distributed. So there was a huge amount of energy that went over 18 months into delivering a report which had multiple recommendations, 23, some of them very good ones that haven't been actioned. And one of the recommendations was this establishment of this mandatory bargaining code, which would force the platforms to pay money. Now, France had made a deal separately. This is a new thing that's come in like I said, the last 24 hours. So I don't have a firm view on that. But I do think that one of the issues, I think the government would feel, our government, the treasurer would feel that they brought the platforms kicking and screaming to the table. They forced them. Facebook turned the lights out, as we know, for 3 or 4 days for all news sites. But ultimately, a piece of legislation passed that would, under designation, would force the platforms to negotiate and to have an arbitration process and all these things, which they were very reluctant to do, but which they fought hard against the legislation, said that they might have to withdraw from the country. But then what's happened after the legislation is passed is that neither of the platforms have been designated under it. So my concern with it is that we don't know how much of those, by estimates, $500 million going to these the publishers over the next 5 years from Google and Facebook, how much of that is actually going to go on journalism? Some of it might go into other initiatives. A lot of it's not being paid, as I understand it, in cash. It's being paid in YouTube ad credits and all these other things. So the platforms were very reluctant. The government sees it as a success. I think if you're the CEO of Nine Entertainment or News Corp Australia or Seven West, where by some reporting, up to 90% of the money is going to those 3 companies, you're feeling pretty good about it. How much is it going to help innovation in the marketplace? How much is it going to help smaller publishers? Yes, to a degree, this money been going to smaller publishers, but is it going to be enough to stem the losses? And so my feeling really, Christopher, is that the process should have been more public. We should be able to know how much money is going to which publisher, and also be able to track how much of this is going to hiring journalists. Now, I hope I know that there's going to be some major hiring happening over the next 6 months. There's going to be lots of jobs going up. I hope that stems this decade of decline we've seen, and that this marks a moment when we can look back in 4 or 5 years' time where we got to like the nadir, we got to rock bottom, and maybe there's 500 more journalists or whatever over this next period. We don't yet know. I think the lack of public, the ability for the public to scrutinize it is concerning.
Great. Okay, fantastic. And there's a related question, I think, from Harrison. Harrison, are you able to get to your microphone to ask your question that starts with Kevin Rudd's recent argument?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks, Simon. That was a really interesting presentation, and so I followed the PS Media now as well because I'd really like to see how that goes. So that's pretty exciting. But my question is around the recent what do you call it? The Senate inquiry into media diversity, which is still ongoing. So my question is, Kevin Rudd recently argued in a Senate committee that print journalism sets the daily news agenda and uses this premise to argue for a more diverse print news ownership in Australia. What relationship does print journalism have on the other forms of news reporting, such as radio, television, and online websites? Do you agree or disagree with the former PM statements, and why or why not?
Yeah, I think I do agree. I think, I was amazed, as you've heard, I began my career in the UK. And in the UK, and I worked for Murdoch for a long time in the UK and in Australia. And in the UK, I remember that there was always a feeling, and at that stage, Rupert owned the Sun, the Sun, the News of the World, the Times, and the Sunday Times. And the Times and Sunday Times had this weird relationship thing going where they had a separate editorial, advisory board that appointed the editor, and supposedly Rupert couldn't have anything to do with them. And they were broadly centrist, the Times and Sunday Times, right of centre broadly, but didn't have too much influence. But even then, in the UK, with about 30% of the print market, people felt that News Corp was far too powerful. And so to come to Australia and understand that in this market, around 70% of the print market is News Corp controlled. I really feel that for the biggest percentage of our population who get their news from one of the major News Corp tabloids, or listen to commercial radio where the news agenda is driven by what's on the front page of those tabloids, or the Australian, or watch 7 and 9, where again the news agenda is definitely, the newspapers set the tone of the day, the narrative of the day, the agenda of the day. And so I do think there's a kind of, overall in the digital economy, a digital news environment, there's more media diversity, but certainly in print, which drives, is really closely linked to broadcast, which for big percentages of the population, certainly older than you guys, is a key way, whether it's radio, drive time, or 7 Sunrise, or the Today Show, or whatever is on at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock on television. It's very much still, I think, an agenda that's driven by news. So I can understand very much about the concerns. And it's obviously what I think has been really interesting about this process is that while it was Rudd's petition, it was into media diversity generally, and it was looking at the platforms as well as News Corp. It's been interesting to see the slightly uncomfortable when they had Rudd and Turnbull on Insiders, I remember vividly. Probably don't like each other very much, but are united in a concern about the power that Murdoch has over Australian media. So yeah, I think it's very interesting. I'm also curious to see where it goes to. I mean, the digital, the Small Publisher and Innovation Fund came out of a kind of horse trade that Senator Nick Xenophon had kind of driven when there was a change in ownership rules in major metros. And I'm interested because this, as you say, this inquiry is running and will continue to run, I think, from a big part of the rest of this year. As we get close to the back end of the year and into an election, maybe something might come up where, I think as they have a greater awareness of how little of this Facebook and Google money is actually going to the smaller publishers, where there might be a push, and it's part of what's been asked to try and create more media diversity across the board. And I think, it's crazy to me that, cities like Adelaide, Brisbane, Perth are kind of one newspaper towns, and I feel that that's very concerning. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Harrison. And there's a sort of related question. Maddie, you hold on for a bit. You'll be next. You'll be pretty much close to the front of the queue. I've just got to ask a follow-up through Harrison's question. Yeah, Harrison sort of implies in one of his other questions a question about these hopeful shoots, these green shoots that are happening with getting funding redirected back from the tech companies and the various committees which are looking into these problems. Are we in a situation where we're so desperate that all we end up with is just getting more journalism happening, or can we say that at the same time it's possible to deal with long-standing issues of quality? I mean, are we so desperate that we just need bums on seats, as it were, or at the same time can we talk and chew gum at the same time and actually improve the standards of journalism, which, as you said in your talk, have become a kind of a matter of public concern?
Yeah, and I think, like as I've painted the picture, when I started in journalism as a reporter, there was so many layers of eyes on your copy before it went into the newspaper. There was an initial subreddit, then a deputy chief sub, a chief sub, the news editor. So at least 5 eyes were on your copy, usually asking you for to check something or to make another call or whatever. So there was a really, really long-running kind of structure that was designed to improve your English and make sure that it was readable, but also to make sure that it was verified and that it was trustworthy. And so it was very rare, I remember as a kid, to ever see typos in the paper. I mean, I remember vividly my first editor. He was a tyrant, a real Fleet Street kind of old school boozer guy. And he used to throw the phone at my head and scream at me and calling me the worst things in the world because I had my apostrophes in the wrong place. I learned where to put my apostrophes. I learned how to punctuate. But I also think that kind of system created a very high quality product. Now I can open the paper every day and I can see typos. I can see that the quality, no shit, has gone out because most of those layers have gone. Most papers have a very small backbench now, very few amounts of subs. Often it's outsourced. So Fairfax, over the last 5 years, has had all their subbing done in New Zealand rather than Australia. News Corp are now doing it with hubs for all their papers. So somebody in Melbourne or Sydney is subbing a paper from Darwin or Cairns, and so there's no local kind of knowledge. And they're getting through, like 20 stories on a shift. So of course the quality level is down. So yeah, I do think that's a very good question. And I do think that part of the trust issue we've got across the world is just that fact that the product is, people read things and they're like, is there any reporting even gone into this thing? Is it not just a press release, And, I really think that those are some of the fundamental questions. I sort of think that, and PS is going to be quite motivated by this idea of less is more. And it's much better to have quality than quantity. Whereas, so many of our commercial businesses now are driven by, getting out, a reporter doing 8 stories on a shift. Like literally, how can any of those reports be good when you're doing a report an hour? You can't get out of the office to do anything. You can't hardly make a call when you're doing that. It's just commodity journalism, and it's cheap and it's shit. So I do think that that sense of less is more, and certainly the outlets that I enjoy are the ones where that you can see the quality of the work because people have spent time on it. So yeah, it's a really good question and a really good point, I think, and it's important.
Thank you so much. Maddie, can you turn your microphone on and put your question to Simon?
I sure can. Thank you, Simon, and that was such a great presentation. Very, very thought-provoking and concerning at the same time, but also the green shoots were great at the end with the work you're doing. I have a bit of a left field question, but I guess I'll start by saying, has it ever crossed your mind that perhaps our government and other right-wing governments around the world are taking a leaf out of Trump and Murdoch's book? And what I mean by that is that I guess if you look back at your career, have you ever experienced a time where relationships between politicians and media owners has been commented on or questioned in the public sphere this much?
Yes, I have. It was, reported a lot, even when I was a kid, how there was a revolt, like, every time Rupert was in town, he would speak with Thatcher or Major or whoever in the UK. So I think there's long been a feeling like, the Sun was a very powerful, influential tabloid in the UK. Just one tabloid, but had a kind of combined influence in the same way as we've seen here in Australia in terms, the power. I remember. I think the famous front page in the UK was the last person in Britain to turn out the lights, with a picture of Neil Kinnock, who was running against Thatcher, his head on a light bulb. And then the Sun said the next day after he lost election, it was the Sun that won it. And there was this very close relationship between Thatcher and Murdoch in the 80s. And I think so. That's and I think it was reported outside, of course, of the News Corp papers a lot. So I do think that, and I also think if you go back into the 19th century and the early 20th century, that was a big reason why rich men wanted to own newspapers, and sadly it was always men, was that sense of power and influence. And it's amazing, really, that businesses which, News Corp is a big behemoth in media terms, with quite a small business in comparison, certainly to the platforms or the bigger television networks, but has a massively disproportionate amount of power. And I think that that's a driver, I think, and always has been for Rupert and for Lachlan. And I think that it does. It's concerning, and I remember very vividly, because I was working in Holt Street, and I remember when we came in the day that it was the day that Abbott.
Hey, Simon.
Yeah, sorry.
Simon, you better explain what Holt Street is.
So sorry. Holt Street is the headquarters of News Corp in Surrey Hills, which is where the Australian and the Daily Telegraph are. And where I work at news.com.au, and it's where I worked for 18 months when I was working there before BuzzFeed. And at that time, it was in 2013 when Abbott won the election in, I think, October that year. There was a front page which had a picture of Rudd, and it was like, "Kick this mob out." And it was so, the Sun always did take a position usually for the right of politics, but it usually only did it on the, sorry, my baby, you can probably hear. Only did it on the day of the election, but this was like 6 weeks out from the election. And I remember that there was great, absolute disgust really by many, many people working there, that this, because apparently this had appeared with the influence of a chap called Cole Allen, who was a former editor of the Daily Telegraph, who'd been the editor of the New York Post, the big Murdoch tabloid in the States. And he'd come back just for the election, and apparently he'd written this front page or put it together. And people were like, why are we taking this position? Why is it so politicized? We should be looking at all the policies that the government have got, and also the alternatives. So yeah, I think that there's it's concerning, and it always has been. But this is kind of the realities as well of sometimes why people own newspapers.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Maddie. Do you have a follow-up, or shall I go to the next question? Now, tell Simon what you've been doing. You've been doing some interesting stuff in this field, have you not, Maddie?
Yeah, I actually work at GetUp. I'm not sure if you're. I'm not sure.
I'm very aware. Yeah.
Yeah, I work across the road from Holt Street, so I have to be very careful what I say when I'm walking to and from work. But I run the campaign with my team on media diversity, and I have many, many follow-up questions because this is what I do every day, 5 days a week. But I'm going to save them because I think Kaveh has some important questions as well. But yeah, it'd be great to connect just outside of this to chat further, and I'll use your contact info to do that.
Yeah, great. And I think it's the GetUp report, the recent report on media diversity, is a really good read. I really enjoyed that, and I also very much enjoy every time I'm heading down Elizabeth Street, the very gigantic mural of Scott Morrison, which I think you've got near your office, which is really brilliant. I think this is very important in a media market where attention is so controlled by one company, and it was certainly, I did work for Rupert myself for a long part of my career, and I felt okay with that in the UK because when I worked for the Times, it was a very balanced newspaper which had a really a big range of opinion in its opinion pages and a very balanced view on news reporting. and that is not the case in mostly, with exceptions in the News Corp papers, sadly here. And so I do think it's, I think the thing that really frustrated me was the coverage of the fires and the disinformation and misinformation and the false equivalence in opinion, where a climate skeptic, scientist, when there's 1 in 1,000, is given equal weighting every kind of day consistently with a scientist who believes in man-made global warming, climate change, and all the factors that led to the fires. And that sense of just the way that the information environment was so polluted there, not in unhinged places on Facebook or YouTube videos, but actually in the pages of our national broadsheet, was concerning. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Maddie. Kaveh, you've got a question. Are you able? I was asking Kaveh if his children were making the
Mine,
noise.
I'm sorry. My baby doesn't want to go to bed.
I mean, it's really kind of you, and I suppose we should give you an out time, maybe 8 o'clock. Is that okay? If we,
yeah, that's
is
great.
that be fine?
Yeah. I need to read my son. I need to read him. We're reading Sherlock Holmes, and yeah, I'll need to get upstairs by 8 o'clock to read him that. Okay,
we'll make sure we finish by then, maybe slightly before. Kaveh, could you turn your microphone on, please?
Yeah, guys, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, Simon will have 2 kids yelling and screaming in a second. I've got mine in the background somewhere as well. Thank you so much for your presentation, and again, like many others, I've got so many questions, but I'm just going to ask you this one. What baffles me is the way that global democracies, especially ours in this country, are also beginning to gear towards press freedom rather than a free press for the people, right? And this is despite the fact that our politicians pay lip service to the notion of freedom. What do you think that is? How do you explain this? Do you think it's just a resurgence of populism, or how would you explain this?
Yeah, I think it's been very concerning over the last sort of decade, certainly since 2013, how the politicians, understandably, of whatever persuasion in a democracy, are often reluctant to be grilled and interrogated by reporters, right? And they want to duck and cover. But up until recently in Australia, as I understand it, there wasn't this attempt to criminalize sometimes journalists for doing their jobs, and to create legislation which is continuing to. There's some trials that are running in Canberra at the moment, which are being held completely sub judice and without any ability for reporters to even report what is going on around who within bureaucracy has been leaking stuff about what happened in Afghanistan. I think the fact that the government has introduced legislation which can criminalize journalists and their sources, in a supposedly free democracy like ours, is very concerning. And yeah, I do think it's something that came. I mean, I think it's over that arc of time. It's been very interesting for me that it seems to have come with this more, the foreign policy of detention and the sovereign borders and the rhetoric about that. I remember vividly when Morrison was the immigration minister, how there was this kind of this sense of this front and this sense of trying to really put immense pressure and deploy the security services to snoop basically on journalists. And we had some issues with that at BuzzFeed with one of our reporters, because we did some really really hard to do reporting on Nauru, but we did reporting on what was going on in Nauru and this terrible syndrome that affected kids there. And we came under immense pressure from government to try and have equivalence over something, but then we weren't even allowed to go there. So I think that sense of really the government tightening the screws and trying to control the narrative, and actually introducing legislation that can criminalize the practice of journalism, which for centuries has been part of what a healthy democracy is. The fourth estate is there to keep the judiciary and to keep government honest. And so, I think I found that very, very concerning. And we've seen obviously after in the wake of Trump, how Trump was deploying the FBI and trying to deploy trying to use Department of Justice to get phone records on journalists and to really deploy the apparatus of the state. And that is, that is really concerning to me. This is stuff that has always felt so. I spent some time, right at the beginning of my career in Moscow, and at that time there was, the legacy obviously of Soviet rule, but also immense pressure on the practice of journalism. Never thought I'd see it in, a democracy like Australia. So it really is. I think that's a concerning trend, and one that I think people are motivated and fighting, but also so much of it is kind of kept under, they literally try and keep it out of the public eye.
Thank you very much, Clave. That's a great question.
Yeah.
I'd like to, we have such an international cohort this evening. It's really wonderful, and I probably won't even have time to cover, to give questions to people from every country that we've got in the classroom tonight, which is a pity. But I'm going to go to Guanhua in mainland China. You had a question, Guan?
Yeah, could you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
very clearly.
Okay. Before I ask the question, please allow me to say a thank you for Simon. Thank you to bring this great presentation. Really inspired me a lot. And I only have two questions here. I think the first one is you mentioned that the traditional media like newspaper or other like the national television, the audiences are shrinking. So how do you think about this phenomenon? What do you think is the advantages of traditional media that cannot be replaced by social media? And the second question is that during the COVID lockdown in Sydney, what role did you think that the traditional media and the social media that play separately? And how do you ensure that the modern audiences who obtain information mainly through the social media always can accept professional and credible information instead of those lies and myths? So I really sorry from your answer.
Thank you. Yeah. Great questions. Yeah, so I think, don't get me wrong, I've used Facebook, Twitter, social platforms, TikTok. I think that there's immense good that has come from the connectivity that social platforms provide. But I do think, and there is good journalism being done by certain people on all of those platforms. But I do think that one of the big issues is that kind of invisible role that media played, and obviously I'm very focused on the local level, at just keeping kind of society working effectively and asking the questions that need to be asked. I think that that's something that is not, there's not something around that allows somebody to become a big influencer on a particular social platform. It's kind of unsexy work. It's not about building big profile. It's just basically about keeping the bastards honest, and it's just a kind of invisible role that media has played. So for me, the collapse in the business model, doesn't allow, from the social platforms, a way of supporting that kind of important, maybe quite dull but necessary kind of scrutiny work. So that is an issue. I think that, and I think Substack is interesting because I think that sense of providing a subscription model to allow local journalists, and this chap I'm working with in Murray Bridge, small town, 25,000 people, he's getting close to being sustainable there with that. So there are opportunities, but yeah, I think that's a challenge. In terms of like lockdowns generally, I think it's, I don't know whether I've kind of banished it from history. Maybe it was because the whole of Australia was in the same boat last year. But now that we're into a lockdown here in Sydney, and one of the issues clearly has been the lack of communication, particularly to a range of first or second generation communities, non-English language predominantly, in areas like Fairfield, Campbelltown, Bankstown in Western Sydney, that the government, despite a year of being able to prepare in Australia, hasn't done well, and we didn't see it doing well this time last year in Melbourne either, with communicating effectively to communities in their own first languages. And so I think that is where it's been very important. Only now, sort of 3 weeks into lockdown in Sydney, are they working on communicating in Assyrian or communicating in Vietnamese effectively to communities there. And so I do think that sense of, media, and ABC are just starting to do that here, but also government really thinking about how they can provide authority in spaces, because what we sadly see in Australia, but certainly in the US, where they have not effectively communicated to communities, is that some of the slowest take-ups on vaccine are in populations which have not been effectively messaged to. Whereas in the UK, actually, I think they've done a really, really good job. They've had very clear data on vaccine take-up, and they've worked very hard to, particularly around Bangladeshi communities and Pakistani communities, to make sure that stuff's going out in Urdu or Bangladeshi or whatever. So yeah, I think it's really important to speak to people where they are on the platforms that they use, and that government and publishers, that should be part of their obligations to make sure that they're not just assuming that everyone speaks English.
Just a follow-up question there, Simon, from me, following on from Guan Hua's question. I was we were in a class a few weeks ago, and I was talking to students about their use of social media and the fact that very few of them are actually reading traditional news sources. And one of the students, we were talking about the massive kind of impact that certain social media feeds are having in China when it comes to sort of divisive issues or issues that people are concerned about, like the three-child policy that they've just recently been talked about. The students were saying, basically, one of the students said to me, he said, look, we've got social media. That's the most powerful thing that's going to be, that we've got to, impact upon the government of China. Why do we need journalism? So my follow-up question is basically, well, yeah, why? If social media in China in particular, social media is showing that it can have a certain kind of power. So is that power not enough, or is it exaggerated? What's your view?
Well, I really think one of the things that we certainly have to learn from China is that the models that we have now are not necessarily, they're kind of, like I said, the business model for news as it existed is kind of broken. In my telling of that story, the internet has been a major factor, but the power of the social platforms. Now, if you look at short form video in the Western markets, which has been dominated effectively by Facebook, on Instagram, Snapchat as a kind of competitor, and only now power of TikTok, a Chinese app. If you look at where TikTok came from, an ecosystem where there's hundreds of competitive apps and platforms, and yes, there's some major players in China, the Chinese internet as well, but there's much more innovation across the board there. And so I do think we have a lot to learn from looking at that. And I've been really interested in some of the commerce models and some of the influencer models and news models that are coming out of China particularly, because I do think that there's a real diversity of experimentation there that we should be learning from. And I think that I think it's really good actually that something like TikTok has come along and is kind of challenging some of the this kind of duopoly type structures that we have in the US. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to see.
Fantastic. Look, time is against us. I'll do one more question, which is to Connie. If you have a question, Connie, I must give you the floor to ask it. Anything that you want to ask Simon about?
Am I on? I've got terrible connection. Hey Simon, thanks for a great presentation, and I hope everyone stayed with it and was listening, because there was so much in there to absorb. I was really interested in your discussion around the news deserts and local news, and excited to see the sort of the concept of PS media, but wondering how that works in practice. Does that does it employ local journalists? And certainly my experience of those local newspapers is you were writing 8 or 9 stories a day back in the day. With on the little country papers, but how do you see that working, and how does the community then not see it almost as a PR newsletter? People get up. I mean, one of the things local papers do is upset their local, as you say, they hold people accountable. They upset their local communities because they talk truth to power. If those communities are the owners, how do you envisage that working?
Yeah, so we've talked about some scenarios, and actually, when we've been getting some really expert, support from via one of our funders, from some senior kind of executives, and they probed quite a lot about how we will deal with, a hypothetical was a paedophile football coach, and how would we report on that, or another one was, some dumping of asbestos or something, and I don't think the structure of what we're trying to do, which is co-owned by our communities, is going to change too much the journalistic imperative. Yes, we are going to employ local journalists. We believe there's a great opportunity, we hope, to hire reporters we want reporters who know that community well. We don't want to embed people in from elsewhere. So we want people to have to be from that place, to have grown up there, or maybe to have been a journalist who used to work for a local paper that's no longer there. But what we believe is that, and it's really about the platform. We're not just taking a content management system off the shelf to do our reporting. We're building a piece of digital community infrastructure, a product that is designed to capture, community's priorities. So that those first 1,000 co-owners will help us prioritize what are the big stories that they think are what does improvement look like in this community over the medium to longer term, and how can reporting drive that? So we deliberately won't be doing things like chasing ambulances or cat up trees. We'll be more focused on the bigger pieces of sort of solutions-focused journalism. And so we've thought, one of my business co-founders is a woman called Meg Simons, you might know of, who was a professor of journalism at the University of Melbourne. And so we've given a lot of thought into how we will provide support for our journalists, but also how we see our journalists much more as kind of, as well as traditional reporters, about being facilitators of community conversations. And internationally, there's this really interesting emergence of collaborative and engaged kind of journalism, participative journalism, which we've been learning a lot about how we want the community to understand perspectives other than their own. And yes, that will upset people sometimes. The platform's going to be closed. It's not going to be like Facebook, where everyone is going to be having a free-for-all in public. People will be sharing directly into specific moderated spaces, which will, and our charter of community responsibility is very much around civil discussion and debate. And if you don't, and people will be, two-step notification, you'll be verified as a real human being with a real email address or phone number. And so if you don't play by the rules, you will be out. So we're going to try and keep it civil very much. We're going to try and return to that sense of robust disagreement sometimes around issues. But we do hope we'll be pissing people off. We have to, we imagine there'll be situations where that is going to, where, like any publisher, any newspaper, where that's going to upset powerful vested interests. And so we'll be prepared to deal with those things when they come up, I hope.
Simon, just thank you so much for your time. And I think there's a child who needs a story read to them, but we've had a wonderful story read to us by you at so many different dimensions. There's so many things more that we could talk about. Just that whole idea that you just mentioned there about the fact that they're almost creating these discrete spaces online. I think that is the future. And one of the things we've been doing in philosophies of journalism is and what we're drilling down into is this amazing proliferation of different new varieties and strands of journalism that are popping up like weeds in a garden. And so our students this term in philosophies of journalism will be writing 50 essays on the different types of from community journalism to to peace journalism to many different forms of journalism that have some of which have been around for a while, others most of which have just sort of sprouted in the last 10-15 years. So normally in a session like this, I'd be able to walk across the room, Simon, and hand you a glass of something, a bottle of something worthwhile. We can't do that tonight, but I'll certainly look forward to seeing you on the other side of this pandemic, and I just can't thank you enough. And if I don't know how we can say thank you other than sort of maybe a small round of applause from a couple of people.
Thank you.
And please keep in touch. Please keep in touch. It was pretty sad, you know, round of applause, but we did our best. Yeah, please keep in touch, Simon, and particularly our students would love to. I think some of them could get quite interested in what you're doing. Thanks again.
Yeah, great. All right, really appreciate it. It's great. Like, I always love talking about this very important industry. I think it's really, as you, I'm sure, gather, I think it's fundamental to how our society works. And so for healthy democracy and thriving communities, I think media and journalism has a really important role to play. So, you know, I think it's important to understand it, even if you don't become a practitioner in journalism. So I really appreciate it. And I'm you know, it's great to have so many international students on the call as well, because I'm very, you know, I've spent quite a bit of time in China in particular, and I'm very interested in seeing, you know, how media models evolve around the world and what we can learn from each other. So thanks so much.
No, thanks very much.
Simon.
Cheers. You guys take care. Everyone stay safe. Bye.
Thanks, Simon.
Thanks, Simon.